The arrow flew wide, and Sebastian Prescott knew in that heartbeat he had made a mistake not in the shot itself, but in wounding a boar rather than dropping it clean. And now 300 pounds of fury and muscle was crashing through the blackberry thicket with blood on its mind, and nowhere left to run but forward. He was already moving, reloading by touch as his boots found purchase on the slick September earth, when he saw her. An orc girl frozen in the clearing ahead. A woven basket tumbled at her feet and dark berries scattered like garnet beads across the grass. Her green face gone pale as new leaves, and her amber eyes locked on the boar as it burst from cover and fixed on her with the single-minded violence of a creature that knows it is dying and wants company on the way down. Sebastian did not think. Thinking was for winter nights by the fire, for tallying coin and mending traps. This was the body's work, and his body knew it well. He closed the distance in 4 long strides, planted himself between the girl and the boar, and raised his rifle even as the beast's hooves tore divots from the ground, and its tusks gleamed wet in the afternoon light. "Don't move," he said, and his voice came out steady, almost gentle, as though he were calming a spooked horse rather than standing in the path of a charging boar. "I've got you." The girl went absolutely still. Later, Sebastian would marvel at the trust it took for her to obey a human stranger when every nerve must have been screaming at her to run. But in the moment, there was only the boar, the shrinking space between them, and the cool weight of the rifle stock against his cheek as he found the shot and took it. The crack of the gun was sharp enough to set birds screaming from the trees. The boar's front legs buckled mid-charge, and it went down hard, momentum carrying it forward in a tumbling slide that stopped less than 3 feet from where Sebastian stood. He kept the rifle trained on it until the twitching stopped, then let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and turned to check on the girl. She was staring at him with an expression he could not quite read: shock, certainly, and relief, but something else beneath that. Something bright and startled that made him suddenly aware of how close they were standing, and how the sunlight caught the curve of her small tusks when her lips parted. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, with her black hair pulled back in a practical braid and dirt on her knees from kneeling to pick berries. Slim and quick-looking, built like a deer rather than a draft horse, and pretty in a way that caught him off guard. "You all right?" he asked, and she nodded mutely, then seemed to remember how to speak. "You stepped in front of it," she said, and her voice was soft and wondering. "You could have been killed." "Could have," Sebastian agreed, "but wasn't. That's what matters." He crouched beside the boar and pulled his hunting knife to begin field dressing it. "You're a long way from the northern ridge if I'm placing your dialect right. What brings you down to the valley?" "Berries," she said, and gestured at the scattered harvest around her feet. "My grandmother makes a syrup that eases coughs, and the blackberries here are sweeter than the ones up by the settlement. I thank you. I should have been paying better attention. I heard something moving in the brush, but I thought it was a deer." "Easy mistake to make," Sebastian said, working the knife with practiced efficiency. "Boars don't usually come this far west, but the acorn crop failed up in the oak belt this year and they're ranging farther for food. I've been tracking this one for 3 days since it gored a settler's cow." He glanced up at her. "I'm Sebastian, by the way, Sebastian Prescott. I run the game trekking service out of the cabin by the creek ford." "Rasha," she said, and then, as though it cost her something, "Rasha Oren. I know who you are. People talk about you, the man who cleared the wolf pack from the sheep pastures last spring, and who found the miller's daughter when she wandered into the forest and got lost." "People talk too much," Sebastian said, but he smiled as he said it. "Though I suppose it's good for business. Speaking of which, you wouldn't happen to know anyone who wants a share of boar meat, would you? This fellow's too much for me to smoke on my own, and it'd be a shame to waste it. Rasha crouched down and began gathering the spilled berries back into her basket, her movements quick and efficient. I could take a haunch back to the settlement if you're offering. Fresh meat is always welcome, and my cousin Tark is handy with a smokehouse. Consider it payment for the scare, Sebastian said, and maybe steer clear of the western thickets for a few days, just in case this fellow had friends. I will, Rasha said, and then she hesitated, worrying at her lower lip with one small tusk. Will you, that is, if you're ever passing through the northern ridge, you should stop by the settlement. I could show you where the best mushrooms grow, the ones the settlers don't know about. As a thank you. There was something hopeful and vulnerable in the way she said it that made Sebastian's chest feel strangely tight. He was not unused to gratitude from the people he helped. It came with the work, along with the occasional payment in eggs or bread or a bottle of someone's home-brewed liquor. But this felt different somehow, more personal. He found himself nodding before he had quite decided to. I'd like that, he said. Though I'm usually pretty busy through harvest season, lots of critters getting bowled around the grain stores. After harvest then, Rasha said quickly, or whenever. I'm often down in the valley on gathering days, Wednesdays and Saturdays mostly. If you're ever at the creek ford when I'm passing through. Sebastian really looked at her, taking in the way she held herself with a mixture of boldness and shyness, the intelligence in her amber eyes, the graceful line of her neck, and felt something shift inside him that he was not quite ready to name. I'm at the creek ford most days, he said. It's where I live, so if you're ever passing through and want to say hello, you're welcome to. The smile that broke across Rasha's face was like sunrise, bright and warming and impossible to look away from. I'll remember that, she said, and then she stood and shouldered her basket, now half full of rescued berries. Thank you again, Sebastian Prescott, for my life and for the meat and for the invitation. Anytime, Sebastian said, and watched her walk away across the clearing with a curious sense that his life had just tilted slightly on its axis and would never quite settle back into its old familiar angle. He finished butchering the boar as the afternoon shadows lengthened, working with the automatic skill of long practice, but his mind was elsewhere. On a green-skinned girl with amber eyes who had trusted him enough to stand still in the face of death. On the way she had said his name, carefully and precisely, as though she were committing it to memory. On the fact that she gathered berries on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and passed by his cabin on the way to and from the valley. It was foolish, probably, to read too much into a moment born of adrenaline and proximity. She had been grateful, that was all, and politeness demanded she offer some gesture of thanks. But as Sebastian hoisted the butchered meat onto his shoulders and began the walk back to his cabin, he could not quite shake the warmth that had settled in his chest, or the hope, small and fragile and absurdly persistent, that maybe, just maybe, she might actually come by to say hello. 3 days passed before Sebastian saw Rasha again. They were busy days, filled with the usual work of late summer, checking his trap lines, scouting for sign of foxes near the henhouses, helping a farmer's son track a runaway bull that had gotten spooked by a hornet's nest and crashed through 2 fences before exhausting itself in a cow pond. It was good work, honest work, and Sebastian had never minded the solitude it required. He had come to the valley 5 years ago after his discharge from the militia, looking for a place where his skills with a rifle and his patience for reading tracks would be valued more than his ability to follow orders or march in formation. He had found it in this patchwork of small farms and frontier homesteads, where settlers needed someone who could deal with the wild things that came down from the mountains, and where nobody asked too many questions about where a man had come from or why he chose to live alone. But that solitude felt different now, heavier somehow, and Sebastian caught himself glancing toward the road more often than usual, watching for a slim green figure with a basket on her hip. She came on Saturday morning, just as he was splitting firewood behind the cabin. He heard her footsteps on the path, light and quick, trying for quiet, and turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing with a cloth-wrapped bundle in her hands and a tentative smile on her face. "I brought bread," Rasha said, holding up the bundle as though it were a talisman against rejection. "And some of the syrup I mentioned, the one my grandmother makes. I thought, well, you gave me the boar meat, and it seemed only fair to return the favor." Sebastian set down the axe and wiped his hands on his trousers, suddenly aware that he was sweaty and probably smelled like wood smoke and honest labor. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but he was smiling as he said it. "Though I won't say no to fresh bread. Store-bought stuff goes stale before I can finish a loaf." Rasha crossed the clearing and held out the bundle, and Sebastian took it with a nod of thanks. Up close, he could see that she had dressed with care, a clean tunic the color of autumn leaves, her hair freshly braided and wound with a scrap of green ribbon that matched her skin. The realization that she had made an effort, that this visit mattered enough to her to warrant preparation, made his heart do something complicated and uncomfortable in his chest. "Would you like to come in?" he asked, gesturing toward the cabin. "I've got tea, and the place is relatively tidy for once." Rasha's smile widened. "I'd like that," she said, and followed him inside. The cabin was small but well kept. A single room with a stone fireplace at one end and a narrow bed at the other, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupying the middle ground. Furs and drying herbs hung from the rafters, and a battered rifle rack held Sebastian's guns and hunting gear. It was a bachelor's space, practical and spare, but clean and comfortable in its way. Rasha looked around with undisguised curiosity while Sebastian filled the kettle and set it on the fire. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, running her fingers along the edge of the table where he had carved his initials years ago during a long winter evening. 5 years, give or take," Sebastian said. "I built the place myself, mostly. Had some help with the roof beams from a neighbor, but the rest is my own work." "It's nice," Rasha said, and she sounded like she meant it. "Cozy. I live with my family, still my grandmother and my uncle and my 3 cousins, all of us packed into a house that's too small and too loud and smells like whatever my uncle is tanning at the moment. Sometimes I dream about having a place of my own, quiet and peaceful like this." Sebastian poured tea into 2 mismatched cups and carried them to the table. "It's peaceful, sure, but it can be lonely too," he admitted. "There are days when the only voice I hear is my own, talking to the chickens. Not that they're great conversationalists." Rasha laughed, a bright sound that seemed to fill the small space and warm it in a way the fire never quite managed. "I'll have to visit more often then," she said. "Save you from discussing philosophy with the livestock." "I'd like that," Sebastian said, and meant it more than was probably wise. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. The valley and its people, the best places to find wild game, Rasha's work as a forager and herbalist's assistant, Sebastian's years in the militia before he mustered out. Rasha was sharp and funny, quick with a joke or a story, and she listened with the kind of focused attention that made Sebastian feel like every word he said mattered. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him that way, and he found himself leaning into it, offering up pieces of himself he usually kept private. "So why did you leave the militia?" Rasha asked, cradling her teacup between her hands. "If that's not too personal a question." Sebastian hesitated, then shrugged. It's not a secret. There was an incident, a training accident with a powder charge that went off too close, knocked me flat, left me deaf in one ear for a few weeks. He touched his right ear reflexively. The hearing came back mostly, but not all the way. And I'd already been thinking about leaving anyway. Too many rules, too much marching, not enough actually doing the thing I was good at. So when they offered me an honorable discharge, I took it. Does it still bother you? Rasha asked. Your ear? Sometimes, Sebastian said, and then, because it seemed important to be honest with her, he added, more than sometimes if I'm truthful. I miss sounds on that side, especially if there's background noise, and it's getting worse, I think, though I try not to dwell on it. Rasha studied him with those sharp amber eyes, and Sebastian had the uncomfortable sense that she was seeing more than he had intended to reveal. But all she said was, that must be difficult in your line of work. I manage, Sebastian said, and then, because he did not want to spend the rest of her visit dwelling on his limitations, he changed the subject. Tell me about these mushrooms you mentioned, the ones the settlers don't know about. Rasha's face lit up, and she launched into an enthusiastic description of the various edible fungi that grew in the valley, complete with tips on identification and harvesting, and which ones paired best with venison versus rabbit. Sebastian listened and watched her talk, captivated by the animation in her expression, and the way her hands moved as she spoke, sketching shapes in the air to illustrate her points. When she finally left, promising to visit again soon, Sebastian stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the path toward the main road. The cabin felt emptier without her, the silence heavier, and he realized with a mixture of pleasure and alarm that he was already looking forward to her next visit with an intensity that bordered on absurd. He was in trouble, he thought. The best kind of trouble, maybe, but trouble nonetheless. Rasha came by again 3 days later, ostensibly to ask his advice about a fox that had been raiding her grandmother's chicken coop. Sebastian walked her through the basics of securing the coop and setting a live trap, and then they spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the bench outside his cabin and talking about nothing in particular. She came by again on Saturday with a basket of apples from a tree near her settlement, and the Saturday after that with a request that he teach her how to read tracks. Sebastian was not a fool. He knew what was happening, could read the signs as clearly as he could read the spoor of a deer in soft earth. Rasha was inventing reasons to visit him, and he was inventing reasons to encourage her, and they were circling each other with the cautious hope of two people who could not quite believe their luck, but were too afraid to name what they were feeling in case speaking it aloud broke the spell. It was a strange, heady time, those early autumn weeks. The valley turned gold and crimson around them, the days shortening and the nights growing crisp, and through it all Rasha kept coming back. Sometimes she brought gifts, food mostly, things she had gathered or her grandmother had made, and sometimes she came empty-handed with a question or a story or simply the desire for company. And Sebastian, who had grown used to solitude and convinced himself he preferred it, discovered that he had been lying to himself for years. He did not prefer solitude. He preferred this: the sound of Rasha's laughter, the way she leaned forward when she was interested in something he was saying, the comfortable silences that sometimes fell between them when words were not needed. They were careful with each other, though, dancing around the thing that was growing between them with the wariness of people who knew that what they felt was not quite acceptable in the eyes of the world. Sebastian had seen the way some of the settlers looked at orcs, the suspicion and disdain that lingered from old wars and older prejudices. And Rasha had her own fears, he suspected, her own awareness of the invisible lines that divided their peoples. But when they were alone together, none of that seemed to matter. The world shrank down to the space between them, and in that space there was only warmth and laughter and the slow, careful building of something that felt like it might be love. It was late October when things began to unravel. Sebastian had taken a contract to track a pack of wild dogs that had been harassing sheep in the eastern pastures. It should have been straightforward work: follow the tracks, find the den, deal with the problem, but the dogs were clever and skittish, and it took him 3 days of cold camping in the hills before he finally located their territory. He was making his way back toward the valley on the morning of the 4th day, tired and hungry and looking forward to a hot meal and his own bed, when he realized he was being followed. He stopped and turned, rifle already halfway to his shoulder, and caught a flicker of movement in the trees off to his left. Except the movement was to his left, and Sebastian had positioned himself so that any approach would come from his good side, which meant he had been tracking on the wrong heading for the better part of an hour and had not noticed until the follower got careless. Ice flooded his veins. He had missed it. The signs, the sounds, whatever small cues should have alerted him that he was not alone. He had missed all of it because his bad ear was worse than he had been willing to admit, and he had let his pride and his fear of losing his livelihood blind him to the truth. The follower turned out to be a lost hound from one of the farms, half-starved and desperate enough to trail a human in hopes of food. Sebastian fed it some jerky and sent it on its way, then stood alone in the forest and faced the fact that he could no longer trust his own senses to keep him alive. The walk back to his cabin was the longest of his life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, made him turn his head and strain to place the direction. Half the sounds he thought he heard were probably imagined, and the other half he was probably missing entirely. By the time he stumbled through his own door, he was exhausted and shaken in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. He needed to stop this, he thought. The tracking, the contracts, the whole fragile life he had built for himself in the valley, before he made a mistake that got someone else killed. Before he walked into a situation he could not handle and never walked back out. And that meant he needed to stop whatever was happening with Rasha, too. Because she deserved better than a man whose body was failing him, a man who could not do the one thing he was known for. She deserved someone whole and capable and certain, not someone who was hanging on by his fingernails and pretending everything was fine. He was still sitting at his table, staring at nothing and nursing a cup of whiskey when Rasha knocked on his door. Sebastian. Her voice was muffled through the wood, but he could hear the concern in it. "Your neighbor said you were back. Are you all right?" He almost did not answer. It would be easier, he thought, to let her think he was asleep or away, to avoid the conversation he knew he needed to have. But Rasha was not the kind of person you could avoid, and he was not the kind of person who could lie to her face, so he stood and opened the door. Rasha took one look at him and her expression shifted from concern to alarm. "What happened?" she demanded, pushing past him into the cabin. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Sebastian said, and heard how hollow the words sounded even as he spoke them. "Just tired." It was a long few days. Rasha set down the basket she had been carrying. More food, he assumed, more reasons to visit, and turned to face him with her arms crossed. "You're lying," she said flatly. "You're a terrible liar, Sebastian Prescott. Now tell me what's wrong before I die of curiosity." And because he was tired, and because she was looking at him with those amber eyes that always seemed to see straight through to the truth of him, Sebastian told her. All of it. The bad ear, the incident that had caused it, the way his hearing had been steadily deteriorating over the years. The fact that he had missed being followed in the forest, that his body was betraying him in the one way he could not afford. The certainty that he needed to stop taking contracts before his limitations got someone hurt or killed. Rasha listened in silence, her expression unreadable, and when he finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "So you're telling me," she said slowly, "that you're going deaf in one ear, and your solution is to stop doing the work you love and presumably also stop seeing me because you've decided you're not good enough anymore." Put like that, it sounded petulant and self-pitying. Sebastian felt heat rise in his face. "It's not about being good enough," he said. "It's about being safe, being competent. I can't do my job properly if I can't hear what's coming." "Then don't do it alone," Rasha said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Take a partner. Someone who can cover your weak side and whose hearing works fine." Sebastian stared at her. "A partner?" "Yes, a partner," Rasha said, and now there was heat in her voice, frustration, and something that might have been hurt. "Someone who cares about you and wants to help. Someone who has spent the last 2 months inventing excuses to see you because she's head over heels in love with you and can't stand the thought of you pushing her away because you're too proud to accept help." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and bright and terrifying. Sebastian's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Rasha, I'm that someone," Rasha continued, barreling forward as though she had not just upended his entire world. "I'm fast, I'm quiet, and my hearing is excellent. I know the land as well as you do, probably better in some places. And I want to do this. Not out of pity, but because I want to be part of your life, and if this is what your life looks like, then I want to be part of it." Sebastian opened his mouth, then closed it again at a loss. Part of him wanted to seize what she was offering with both hands and never let go. But another part, the part that had been trained to be self-sufficient and never rely on anyone else, recoiled at the thought of being so dependent. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally. "Tracking isn't safe work. It's not gathering berries or picking mushrooms. It's getting between a panicked animal and the people it might hurt. It's days in the cold and the wet with no shelter." It's what you do," Rasha interrupted. "And I want to do it with you. Not because I think you can't manage alone, but because 2 sets of eyes and ears are better than 1. Because I think we'd be good together." She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "Please, Sebastian, let me help you. Let me be your partner." The word partner hit him like a physical thing, warm and solid and impossible to ignore. Not helper, not assistant, but partner. Someone who stood beside him as an equal, who chose to be there not out of obligation, but because she wanted to be. "I'm afraid," he said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm afraid I'll fail you, that I'll miss something important and you'll get hurt because of it." "I'm afraid too," Rasha said. "I'm afraid you'll shut me out because you think you have to carry everything alone. But I'd rather be afraid together than safe and separate." Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the set of her jaw and the determination in her eyes, and the way she was standing her ground like a soldier facing down an enemy charge, and felt something inside him crack and give way. She was right. God help him, she was right. He had been so focused on his limitations that he had forgotten the most basic truth of survival, that humans were pack animals, that they had always been stronger together than apart. "All right," he said, and watched her face transform with hope. "All right, we'll try it. But if it doesn't work, if I'm putting you in danger, you have to promise you'll tell me. No heroics, no pretending things are fine when they're not." "I promise," Rasha said. And then, before he could second-guess himself, she closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. Sebastian stood frozen for half a heartbeat, then let himself relax into the embrace, his arms coming up to hold her close. She smelled like herbs and wood smoke, and something sweet he could not name, and she fit against him like she had been made to be there. It was the first time they had touched beyond the casual brush of hands, and the intimacy of it made his chest ache with something too big to name. "Thank you," Rasha whispered against his shoulder, "for trusting me, for letting me in." "Thank you for being stubborn," Sebastian said, and felt her laugh, the vibration of it traveling through his body like warmth. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the small cabin while the autumn wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low in the hearth. And when they finally pulled apart, Sebastian felt lighter than he had in weeks, as though he had set down a burden he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. "So," Rasha said, her smile bright and a little watery, "when do we start?" "Tomorrow," Sebastian said. "I've got a contract to check the northern trap lines for a homesteader who thinks something's been stealing his catches. It's easy work, good for getting used to working as a team." "Tomorrow, then," Rasha agreed, and the way she said it sounded like a promise. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the first hard frost of the season painting the grass white and turning the puddles to thin ice. Rasha arrived at Sebastian's cabin before dawn, dressed in practical leather and wool, her hair braided tight and a long knife at her belt. She looked capable and determined, and Sebastian felt a flicker of pride that this woman, this brilliant, stubborn, wonderful woman, had chosen to throw her lot in with him. They set out together, and Sebastian quickly discovered that Rasha had not been exaggerating about her skills. She moved through the forest like she was part of it, her steps silent and her eyes constantly scanning for signs. She pointed out things he would have missed: a broken branch that indicated something large had passed through recently, a tuft of fur caught on a thorn bush, and when he asked her to listen for movement on his right side, she did so without question or fuss, simply positioning herself to cover his blind spot. It was strange at first, working so closely with another person. Sebastian had been alone for so long that he had forgotten the small choreography of partnership. The silent signals, the unspoken division of labor, the trust required to turn your back on danger because you knew someone else was watching it. But Rasha adapted to his rhythms as easily as he adapted to hers, and by midday, they were moving together with the smooth efficiency of a team that had worked together for years, rather than hours. They found the homesteader's problem by early afternoon. A young fox that had figured out how to spring the traps and steal the bait without getting caught. Sebastian reset the traps with a modification that would prevent the theft, and Rasha scattered some foul-smelling herbs around the perimeter that she swore would discourage the fox from coming back. "My grandmother's recipe," she explained as they walked back toward the valley. "Foxes hate the smell. They'll find easier hunting elsewhere." "Does your grandmother have a recipe for everything?" Sebastian asked, amused. "Pretty much," Rasha said. "She's been an herbalist for 60 years. I think she's forgotten more about plants than most people ever learn." "You must have learned a lot from her," Sebastian said. "I did," Rasha agreed. "Though I was never as patient with the mixing and measuring as she would have liked. I prefer being out in the field, gathering the ingredients rather than brewing them up. That's why I mostly just help her rather than apprenticing properly." "Lucky for me," Sebastian said. "Otherwise you might not have been out picking berries that day, and we never would have met." Rasha glanced at him sidelong, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I don't think that was luck," she said. "I think that was fate, the universe putting me exactly where I needed to be." "You believe in fate?" Sebastian asked. "I believe in patterns," Rasha said. "The way water always finds the lowest path, the way birds know when to fly south. Some things are meant to happen, I think. We just have to be paying attention when they do." Sebastian thought about that as they walked, about the chain of chance and choice that had led him to the clearing that day, rifle in hand and a boar charging toward a green-skinned girl he had never met. If he had been slower, if his shot had gone wide, if Rasha had run instead of trusting him, any one of 100 small variables changed, and they never would have had this. It was a humbling thought, and a grateful one. They reached his cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Rasha paused at the edge of the clearing, and Sebastian realized with a pang that she was about to leave, about to walk back to her settlement and her family, and he would not see her again until the next contract. "Stay," he said, the word escaping before he could think better of it. "For dinner, I mean. It's getting late and it's a long walk back. I can make something, or we can split what you brought in that basket you're always carrying around." Rasha's smile was slow and warm and did something complicated to his insides. "I'd like that," she said. They cooked together in the small cabin, Rasha chopping vegetables while Sebastian worked on a venison stew, and the domestic simplicity of it felt like a glimpse of a future Sebastian had not let himself imagine. They talked and laughed and argued playfully over the proper amount of salt, and when they finally sat down to eat, the meal tasted better than anything Sebastian had made in months. "This is nice," Rasha said, echoing his thoughts. "I could get used to this." "Me too," Sebastian admitted. "I didn't realize how much I'd been missing it. The company, I mean. Someone to talk to who isn't a chicken." "Well, I'm definitely more interesting than a chicken," Rasha said with mock seriousness. "Though I can't promise to lay any eggs." Sebastian laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in his chest and left him feeling lighter. "I'll take the conversation over the eggs any day." They lingered over the meal, and then over tea afterward, neither quite ready for the evening to end. When Rasha finally stood to leave, the moon was high and the stars were bright overhead. Sebastian walked her to the edge of the clearing, suddenly reluctant to let her go. "Same time next week?" Rasha asked. "I heard there's a farmer near the southern boundary who needs help with a badger problem." "Same time next week," Sebastian confirmed, "though you're welcome to stop by before then, anytime you want." "I'll hold you to that," Rasha said, and then, quick as a bird, she leaned up and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Sebastian." She was gone before he could respond, disappearing down the path with that quick, graceful stride of hers. Sebastian stood in the dark and touched his cheek where her lips had been, feeling the warmth of it spread through his whole body. He was smiling like a fool, he knew, but he could not bring himself to care. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sebastian would take a contract, Rasha would meet him at his cabin, and they would tackle the job together. Word got around the valley quickly that the tracker had taken on a partner, and while there were a few raised eyebrows at the fact that said partner was an orc, most people seemed willing to judge them by their results rather than their species. And the results were good. Better than good, if Sebastian was being honest. With Rasha covering his weak side and providing a second perspective on the signs they found, they worked faster and more efficiently than Sebastian ever had alone. But more than that, they worked well together in a way that went beyond simple competence. Rasha seemed to know what he was thinking before he said it, could read his moods and adjust her approach accordingly. When he got frustrated or discouraged, she was there with a joke or a word of encouragement. When he pushed too hard, drove himself too close to exhaustion, she was the one who made him stop and rest and reminded him that being a partner meant letting her carry some of the weight. And Sebastian found himself doing the same for her. Learning her tells, the way she got quiet when she was worried, the way she fidgeted with her braid when she was thinking through a problem. He learned that she was fiercely competitive about tracking, took it as a personal challenge if she missed a sign he spotted. and that she had a terrible sense of direction when it came to reading maps, but could navigate by landmarks and memory better than anyone he had ever met. He learned that she was afraid of deep water, that she had a weakness for honey cakes, that she sang under her breath when she thought no one was listening, and had a voice like warm summer evenings. He learned, in short, that he was hopelessly in love with her, and that the feeling was entirely mutual. They did not speak of it, not directly. But it was there in every shared glance, every casual touch that lingered a moment too long. Every night that Rasha stayed for dinner and neither of them mentioned the lateness of the hour or the impropriety of a young woman spending so much time alone with a man. The valley was too practical to care much about such things, and Rasha's family seemed content to let her make her own choices. But Sebastian knew that there would come a point when they would have to name what they were to each other, make some kind of formal acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them. He was working up the courage to broach the subject when everything came crashing down around his ears. It was late November, the weather turning cold and mean with the promise of snow in the air, when Sebastian got word of a mountain cat that had been spotted near one of the outlying homesteads. Mountain cats were rare in the valley, driven back into the high peaks by human expansion, but every few years one would wander down in search of easier prey. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and more than capable of killing a human if they felt threatened or hungry enough. Sebastian took the contract without hesitation. This was exactly the kind of work he was good at, the kind that required patience and nerve and a steady hand. Rasha met him at dawn, and together they set out toward the homestead, following the rough trail that wound up into the foothills. The signs were easy to follow at first. Clear prints in the soft earth, claw marks on trees where the cat had sharpened its claws, the scattered remains of a deer it had brought down and partially eaten. But as they climbed higher, the terrain grew rougher and the signs more scattered. Sebastian found himself relying more and more on Rasha to point out the subtle clues he was missing: a disturbed patch of leaves here, a faint scent of musk there. They were picking their way through a narrow ravine, the walls pressing close on either side, when Rasha suddenly went still and held up a hand for silence. Sebastian stopped immediately, rifle at the ready, and strained to hear what she had heard. Nothing. Just the wind in the pines and the distant call of a crow. But Rasha was tense, her head cocked at an angle that told him she was tracking something. "What is it?" Sebastian asked, keeping his voice low. "Movement," Rasha said quietly. "Above us on the right I heard rocks shifting." Sebastian turned to look, positioning himself so that his good ear was aimed at the sound, but he still could not pick it out. Frustration spiked through him, hot and bitter. This was exactly what he had been afraid of: a critical moment where his limitations put them both in danger. And then the mountain cat was there, a golden blur of muscle and fury launching itself from a ledge above them. Everything happened very fast after that. Sebastian saw the cat and swung his rifle up, but the angle was wrong, and he knew, even as he pulled the trigger, that the shot would miss. It did, the bullet sparking off rock as the cat landed in the ravine between them. Rasha was already moving, her knife drawn and her body positioned to protect Sebastian's blind side, and the cat fixed on her as the easier target and lunged. Sebastian's world narrowed to a single point of absolute terror. The cat was going to reach Rasha before he could reload, before he could do anything, and she was going to die because he had been too slow and too deaf and too stupid to realize he should never have brought her into danger. But Rasha did not freeze the way she had with the boar. She sidestepped with liquid grace, using the cat's momentum against it, and slashed with her knife as it passed. The blade caught the cat's shoulder, drawing blood and a yowl of pain, and then Sebastian was there, having closed the distance in 3 long strides. He put himself between Rasha and the cat just as it wheeled for another attack, and this time when he fired the rifle, the shot was true. The cat dropped mid-leap, dead before it hit the ground. Sebastian stood over the body, breathing hard, and slowly became aware that Rasha was saying his name. "Sebastian! Sebastian, it's okay, it's done. We're safe." He turned to look at her, and the fear that had been gripping his chest shifted into something else, something darker and more painful. "You could have died," he said, and his voice came out hoarse and shaking. "That thing almost killed you because I couldn't hear it coming, because I was too slow." "You weren't too slow," Rasha said firmly. "You saved my life. Again. The same way you did with the boar." "I put you in danger in the first place," Sebastian shot back. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. I can't keep you safe if I can't do my job properly." "Then it's a good thing keeping me safe isn't your job," Rasha said, and now there was heat in her voice. "I'm your partner, remember? Partners look out for each other. I heard the cat and warned you. You took the shot and killed it. That's how this works." "You shouldn't have to compensate for my weaknesses," Sebastian said stubbornly. "It's not compensating, it's complimenting," Rasha countered. "You're the best tracker in the valley, Sebastian. You read signs I'd miss in 100 years. Your bad ear doesn't change that. It just means you need someone to cover that side, and I'm happy to do it." Sebastian wanted to argue, wanted to push back against the fierce certainty in her voice, but he was suddenly too tired. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that went bone deep. He sank down onto a nearby rock and put his head in his hands. Rasha sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Talk to me," she said quietly. "Tell me what you're really afraid of." And because lying to Rasha had never been an option, Sebastian told her. "I'm afraid I'm going to get you killed. I'm afraid that one day I'll miss something important and you'll pay the price for my limitations. And I'm afraid that even if that doesn't happen, I'm going to wake up one morning and realize I can't hear anything at all, and then what use will I be to anyone?" "You'll still be you," Rasha said. "Smart and brave and kind. Good at reading the land and solving problems and making terrible jokes when you're nervous. Those things don't go away just because your hearing does." "But I won't be able to do this anymore," Sebastian said, gesturing at the dead cat at the forest around them. "And this is who I am. It's all I know how to do." "That's not true," Rasha said. "You're good at a lot of things, and even if tracking becomes too dangerous, you could teach, pass on what you know to the next generation. There's a dozen young people in the valley who'd jump at the chance to apprentice with Sebastian Prescott." "Teaching," Sebastian said, turning the word over in his mind. He had never considered it before, had always assumed he would keep doing this work until his body gave out or his luck ran out. But the idea of passing on his knowledge, of shaping young trackers and helping them avoid the mistakes he had made, there was something appealing about that, something sustainable. "And you wouldn't be doing it alone," Rasha continued. "You'd have me. We'd teach them together. I could cover the herbalism and foraging side, you could handle the tracking and hunting. We'd be a team." Sebastian looked at her, at the determination and love shining in her amber eyes, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. She was right. She had been right all along. He did not have to carry this alone. He did not have to choose between his limitations and his livelihood. There were other paths, other possibilities, and all of them were brighter with her beside him. "I'm sorry," he said, "for pushing you away, for being so stubborn about accepting help." "I forgive you," Rasha said, "on the condition that you stop trying to protect me from the world and start trusting me to handle myself." "Deal," Sebastian said, and then, because the moment felt too heavy and he needed to lighten it, he added, though I reserve the right to step in front of the occasional charging boar." Rasha laughed, the sound bright and welcome in the cold air. "I suppose I can live with that," she said. And then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet aftermath. Two people who had found each other against all odds and were determined not to let go. They brought the mountain cat's body back to the homestead that had requested the hunt, collected their payment, and started the long walk back to the valley. It was full dark by the time they reached Sebastian's cabin, and without discussion, Rasha followed him inside. "Stay," Sebastian said, not a question this time but a statement. "It's late and I don't want you walking back alone. You can take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "Or," Rasha said, "we could both take the bed, if you wanted." Sebastian's heart kicked against his ribs. "Rasha, I'm not asking for anything improper," Rasha said quickly, though the color rising in her green cheeks suggested she was not entirely opposed to the idea. I've spent half the night thinking about what almost happened in that ravine, how close we came to losing this. And I don't want to waste any more time pretending we're just partners or friends when we both know it's more than that." "It is more than that," Sebastian agreed, his voice rough. "It's been more than that since the day you brought me bread and syrup and looked at my cabin like it was a palace." Rasha smiled, small and private. "So we're agreed then. This is more." "This is more," Sebastian confirmed. "Though I should probably ask you properly, court you the way you deserve to be courted, with flowers and poetry and all that nonsense." "I don't need flowers," Rasha said. "I need you. Honest and real and exactly as you are." Sebastian crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands in his. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I'm in love with you, Rasha Oren. Have been since you smiled at me in that clearing and offered to show me where the mushrooms grow." "I love you too," Rasha said, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Have been since you stepped in front of a boar for me and told me not to move, in that calm voice like you faced down death every day before breakfast." Sebastian laughed, giddy with relief and joy, and pulled her into a kiss. She melted against him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and for a long moment there was nothing else in the world but the warmth of her and the taste of her and the absolute rightness of this. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rasha rested her forehead against his and said, "So, about that bed." They slept curled together that night, fully clothed and perfectly proper except for the intimacy of shared warmth and steady breathing. Sebastian lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of Rasha's heartbeat against his chest, and feeling more at peace than he had in years. Whatever the future held, whatever limitations his body imposed, whatever challenges they faced, they would handle it together. And that made all the difference. The weeks that followed felt like a gift, each day brighter than the last. Sebastian and Rasha worked contracts together, and when there were no contracts, they spent their time mapping out plans for the teaching venture Rasha had suggested. They talked to young people in the valley who were interested in learning tracking and foraging, gauged the demand, and began putting together a curriculum. Sebastian found himself getting excited about the prospect in a way he had not anticipated, energized by the idea of shaping the next generation of trackers and leaving a legacy beyond his own work. But they also made time for each other, for the small pleasures that had nothing to do with work or planning. They went for long walks in the winter woods, collected firewood together, cooked elaborate meals that took all afternoon, and filled the cabin with warmth and good smells. Rasha taught Sebastian some of the songs she had learned from her grandmother, and Sebastian taught Rasha how to shoot a rifle properly. They argued good-naturedly about everything from the best way to skin a rabbit to whether autumn or spring was the superior season. And they kissed in the firelight and held each other through the cold nights and built a life together piece by careful piece. It was not always easy. There were still moments when Sebastian's pride chafed at having to ask for help, when the fear of becoming a burden crept back in. And there were moments when Rasha felt the weight of the disapproval from some of the valley's less tolerant residents, the sidelong looks and muttered comments about interspecies relationships. But they weathered those moments together, talking through their fears and frustrations rather than letting them fester, and came out stronger on the other side. December brought the first real snow, a heavy fall that blanketed the valley in white and turned the world quiet and still. Sebastian and Rasha spent a week snowbound in his cabin, and by the time the roads cleared they had hashed out a full plan for their tracking school. They would start small, taking on 2 or 3 apprentices in the spring, and build from there. Sebastian would handle the advanced tracking and hunting skills. Rasha would teach herbalism and wilderness survival, and together they would offer the kind of comprehensive education that no one else in the valley could provide. It was a good plan, a solid plan, and Sebastian felt a surge of gratitude toward Rasha for seeing the potential in it when he had been too mired in his own fears to look beyond his limitations. "We should make it official," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Rasha mending a torn shirt and Sebastian carving a new handle for his skinning knife. I mean, we should let people know we're together, properly together." Rasha looked up from her sewing, her amber eyes bright in the firelight. "Are you asking me to marry you, Sebastian Prescott?" "Not yet," Sebastian said, and grinned at her indignant expression. "I'm asking you to move in with me. Share this place, build our school together, make it official that we're partners in every sense of the word. And then, when the time is right, I'll ask you to marry me properly, with a ring and a speech and all the trimmings." "So this is a practice proposal," Rasha said, her lips twitching with suppressed amusement. "This is me saying I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night," Sebastian said. "And if that requires me to formally ask you to move your things into my cabin, then consider this me asking." Rasha set down her sewing and crossed the room to sit beside him. "I accept," she said solemnly, and then, unable to keep the smile from her face, "though I expect that real proposal to be very impressive when it comes." "I'll do my best," Sebastian promised, and kissed her to seal the deal. Rasha moved in the following week, bringing her few possessions and her vast knowledge and her bright, warm presence into the cabin that had been Sebastian's sanctuary, and now became their home. It required some adjustments, a second set of shelves for her herbs and tinctures, a larger bed to replace Sebastian's narrow bachelor palate, some negotiation over whose cooking methods were superior, but they made it work. They made everything work, because that was what partners did. Word spread quickly through the valley that Sebastian and Rasha were together, living openly as a couple. The reactions were mixed. Most people were supportive or at least indifferent, too busy with their own lives to care much about who was sleeping where. But there were a few who made their disapproval known: a storekeeper who refused to serve Rasha when she came in alone, a farmer who pulled his contract rather than work with an orc, a handful of anonymous notes left on their doorstep suggesting that they should be ashamed of themselves. It stung, that casual cruelty, but it also strengthened Sebastian's resolve. He loved Rasha, and he was not going to hide that or apologize for it. So when the storekeeper refused service, Sebastian made a point of taking his business elsewhere and letting everyone know why. When the farmer pulled his contract, Sebastian shrugged and said there were plenty of other people who needed his services. And when the notes appeared, he and Rasha burned them in the fireplace and agreed that anyone too cowardly to sign their name was not worth their time. For every person who disapproved, there were 3 who supported them. The homesteader they had helped with the fox problem brought them a basket of apples and a handwritten note thanking them for their work. The family whose sheep they had saved from wild dogs invited them to dinner and treated Rasha like an honored guest. And slowly, steadily, the tide of opinion shifted in their favor as people realized that Sebastian and Rasha were not going anywhere, that they were serious about each other, and about the life they were building together. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth, their tracking school was ready to launch. They had 3 apprentices lined up. A 16-year-old boy named Tobin who wanted to learn tracking, a 17-year-old girl named Mara who was interested in herbalism, and a quiet 19-year-old named Evan who wanted to do a bit of both. All 3 were eager and hardworking, and Sebastian found himself enjoying the teaching far more than he had expected. It was different from tracking, required a different kind of patience, but it was satisfying in its own way. Watching Tobin's face light up when he successfully identified a deer trail, or seeing Mara carefully harvest wild ginger under Rasha's watchful eye, gave Sebastian a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. He was building something that would outlast him, passing on knowledge that would keep the valley safe for years to come. And through it all, Rasha was beside him, teaching alongside him, laughing with him, challenging him, loving him. She was the best partner he could have asked for, and he told her so as often as he could manage. "You're only saying that because I cooked dinner," Rasha teased one evening as they sat on the bench outside their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley. "I'm saying it because it's true," Sebastian countered. "Though the dinner was excellent, I'll grant you that." Rasha leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable and content. "I'm happy," she said quietly. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be. Thank you for letting me into your life." "Thank you for barging in and refusing to leave," Sebastian said, and felt her laugh, the vibration of it traveling through his body like warmth. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade and the stars begin to appear. And then Sebastian reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden box he had been carrying around for the past 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Rasha," he said, and his voice came out steady despite the way his heart was hammering. "I told you back in December that I'd ask you properly when the time was right. I think the time is right now." Rasha sat up, her eyes wide and her mouth forming a small O of surprise. Sebastian opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring set with a small amber stone that matched her eyes. He had commissioned it from the valley's blacksmith, paying in furs and labor, and he was absurdly proud of how well it had turned out. "Rasha Oren," he said, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I build my life with for as long as we both shall live?" Rasha's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded frantically, unable to speak. Sebastian slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like salt and joy and promise. "Yes," Rasha finally managed when they broke apart. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They held each other as the stars came out overhead, and Sebastian felt a peace settle over him that he had not known since before the accident that had damaged his hearing. His life was not what he had planned, not what he had imagined when he first came to the valley, but it was good. It was his. And he would not trade it for anything. They were married in late May, on a warm afternoon when the valley was in full bloom and the air smelled like apple blossoms and fresh cut grass. The ceremony was small, held in the clearing near Sebastian's cabin with a handful of friends and neighbors as witnesses. Rasha wore a dress the color of new leaves, and Sebastian wore his best shirt and a smile that threatened to split his face in two. Rasha's family came down from the northern ridge for the occasion. Her grandmother, a formidable old orc with silver hair and sharp eyes, her uncle Tark, her 3 cousins. They brought food and music and enough good cheer to fill the clearing to bursting. A few of Sebastian's old militia friends made the journey as well, and the valley's residents turned out in surprising numbers to wish them well. The ceremony itself was brief and heartfelt. They spoke their vows standing beneath an oak tree, promising to stand by each other through whatever came, to be partners in all things, to build a life together that honored both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. When the officiant, a kindly old woman who served as the valley's unofficial justice of the peace, pronounced them married, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was food and drink and dancing, and Sebastian found himself swept up in the joy of it, the sense of community and belonging that he had not quite allowed himself to feel before. People toasted them, wished them happiness, told stories about the times Sebastian had saved their livestock or Rasha had brought them herbs when they were ill. It was overwhelming and wonderful, and Sebastian held Rasha's hand through all of it, anchoring himself to her warmth. When the party finally wound down and the last of the guests had staggered home, Sebastian and Rasha retreated to their cabin, their home, and collapsed onto their bed in a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. "That was perfect," Rasha said, her voice muffled against Sebastian's chest. "Everything I wanted and more." "It was pretty great," Sebastian agreed, "though I'm fairly certain your cousin Maro drank enough for 3 people and is going to have a spectacular headache tomorrow." Rasha laughed. "That's Maro for you, always overdoes it at celebrations." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, too tired to do more than hold each other and breathe. And then Rasha said, voice soft and tentative, "Sebastian, do you ever think about children?" Sebastian went still, considering the question. It was something they had not discussed in detail, too focused on building their school and their life together to think much beyond the immediate future. But now that she raised it, he found the idea surprisingly appealing. "I do," he said carefully. "I think about what they'd be like. Whether they'd have your eyes or my nose, whether they'd grow up to be trackers like us or find their own path." He paused. "Is that something you want?" "I think so," Rasha said. "Not right away, maybe, but someday, when we're ready." "Then someday it is," Sebastian said and kissed the top of her head. "We've got time. No need to rush anything." But as it turned out, someday came sooner than expected. By midsummer, Rasha was pregnant, her slim frame just beginning to show the subtle signs of the life growing within her. They were both terrified and thrilled in equal measure, stumbling through the reality of impending parenthood with the same stubborn determination they had brought to everything else. The pregnancy was not easy. Rasha was sick for the first few months, unable to keep much food down and exhausted beyond reason. Sebastian fretted and hovered until she threatened to brain him with a cooking pot, and then he channeled his nervous energy into preparing the cabin for a baby. He built a cradle from oak wood, smooth and sturdy, and Rasha's grandmother sent down blankets and baby clothes along with a steady stream of advice about what to expect. Their apprentices stepped up to help run the school while Rasha rested, and Sebastian found himself juggling teaching and contract work, and taking care of his increasingly grumpy wife with varying degrees of success. But they managed, the way they always managed, and by the time the leaves began to turn gold again, Rasha's sickness had passed, and she was glowing with health and anticipation. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving with a lusty cry that could probably be heard halfway across the valley. He was perfect and terrifying, a tiny warm weight with Sebastian's dark hair and Rasha's amber eyes, and a pair of small tusks that would grow more prominent as he aged. They named him Zeke, and Sebastian held him with shaking hands and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. "He's beautiful," Rasha whispered, exhausted and radiant in the bed. "He's perfect." "He is," Sebastian agreed, unable to look away from the small face. "He really is." Parenthood turned out to be harder than any tracking job Sebastian had ever taken. Zeke was demanding and loud and required constant attention, and there were nights when Sebastian and Rasha stumbled through their duties half asleep and wondering how anyone ever survived this. But there were also moments of pure magic. Zeke's first smile, the way he reached for Sebastian's face with tiny fingers, the soft weight of him sleeping on Rasha's chest while she hummed lullabies. They learned as they went, making mistakes and figuring out solutions and leaning on each other when things got overwhelming. Their school went on hiatus for a few months while they adjusted to their new reality, but their apprentices were patient and understanding, and by the time spring rolled around again, they were ready to resume teaching. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and louder than before but rich with love and purpose. Zeke grew from a tiny baby into a curious toddler, and then into a bright, energetic child who showed every sign of inheriting his parents' love for the wilderness. Sebastian taught him to track almost before he could walk, pointing out animal prints and teaching him the names of trees. Rasha taught him about plants, which ones were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick, and Zeke absorbed it all with the boundless enthusiasm of the very young. Their school thrived as well, growing from 3 apprentices to 8 to a dozen. They added a second building to house the students during their intensive training periods, and Sebastian found himself training young trackers who would go on to work throughout the valley and beyond. Some of them stayed on as assistants, helping to teach the new cohorts and building their own reputations. It was deeply satisfying work, and Sebastian was grateful every day that Rasha had pushed him to see beyond his limitations and imagine a different future. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Zeke grew tall and strong, more interested in tracking than herbalism, but with his mother's sharp eyes and quick wit. Other children followed: a second son named Dax when Zeke was 4, and then a daughter named Hannah 2 years after that. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and what had once been Sebastian's solitary sanctuary became a bustling home full of laughter and noise and love. Sebastian's hearing continued to deteriorate, as he had known it would. By the time Zeke was 10, Sebastian was almost completely deaf in his right ear and struggling with the left as well. But it did not matter the way he had feared it would. He had built a life that did not depend on perfect hearing, surrounded himself with people who knew how to work with his limitations rather than being hindered by them. Rasha was still his second set of ears, and their children learned early to position themselves where he could see them when they spoke, and he was happy. Deeply, profoundly happy in a way that still surprised him sometimes when he stopped to think about it. His life was full and rich and purposeful, and all of it traced back to a single moment in a clearing when he had stepped between an orc girl and a charging boar and said, "Don't move. I've got you." It was early autumn again, the air crisp with the promise of coming cold, when the valley held its annual harvest festival. The whole community turned out for it, a day of games and food and celebration that marked the successful bringing in of the crops and the beginning of preparations for winter. Sebastian and Rasha attended with their children. Zeke now 17 and helping to run some of the games, Dax 13 and more interested in the food stalls, and Hannah 11, and determined to win the archery competition. They wandered through the festival together, greeting friends and former students, sampling roasted meat and fresh bread and the honey cakes that Rasha still loved. People stopped to talk, to thank them for the apprentices they had trained or the help they had given over the years. It was warm and welcoming, and Sebastian felt a fierce pride in the community they had helped to build. "Hard to believe it's been almost 20 years, Rasha said as they sat on a blanket watching Hannah compete in the archery finals. "Since the day we met." 20 years, Sebastian repeated, marveling at it. "Feels like both yesterday and a lifetime ago." "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day?" Rasha asked. "If the boar had—" "No," Sebastian said firmly, taking her hand. "I don't think about that. I think about what did happen. That I was there, that you trusted me, that we found each other. Everything else is just details." Rasha smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I trusted you from the first moment," she said. "When you told me not to move, I believed you completely. I don't know why, I just knew that you meant it, that you'd keep me safe." "And I did," Sebastian said. "And you've kept me safe right back every day since. That's what partners do." Around them, the festival continued, a riot of sound and color and life. Their children were laughing with friends. Their apprentices were demonstrating tracking techniques to interested youngsters, and the valley spread out before them in golden afternoon light. It was not a perfect life. There were still challenges, still prejudices to overcome, still hard days when Sebastian's limitations frustrated him, or Rasha felt the weight of being different. But it was their life, built together through trust and love and stubborn determination, and Sebastian would not have changed a moment of it. "Look," Rasha said, pointing. "Hannah just made the finals." They watched their daughter step up to the line, her face set in fierce concentration. She drew, aimed, and released, and the arrow flew true, striking the center of the target with a solid thunk that drew cheers from the crowd. "That's our girl," Sebastian said, pride swelling in his chest. "That's our family," Rasha corrected, gesturing to encompass their 3 children, the community gathered around them, the life they had built together. "All of this. Everything we've made." Sebastian pulled her close and kissed her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "Everything we've made," he agreed. "And I wouldn't trade it for the world." The sun was setting by the time the festival wound down, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Sebastian and Rasha gathered their children and started the walk back to their home, tired and happy and complete. They had come so far from that day in the clearing, from the moment when a human tracker had stepped between an orc girl and death, and everything had changed. But in the ways that mattered, they were still exactly where they had started, together, trusting each other, building something beautiful out of faith and partnership and love that refused to be constrained by the expectations of others. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.